Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Chad Hilliard. I'm the Vice President of Corporate Development here at the Center for Healthcare Solutions. And welcome to today's webinar, How Safe is Your Space? Preventing and Managing Violence in the Workplace. Today's session is brought to you by our corporate partner, Cura Hospitality. Our presenter today is Brian Tucker. Brian is a veteran of the hospitality industry. His 30 years of experience has ranged from restaurants and catering to contract food services. He has spent the last decade in human resources in learning and development and HR management roles. In his current role as Human Resources Director for Cura Hospitality, he partners with operations leaders to align a people strategy that aligns with the organization's operational and growth goals. Today's session will be followed by a Q&A. You could submit your questions through the Q&A tab or the chat tab. I will be monitoring both. And at this point, I would like to turn the show over to Brian Tucker. So welcome, Brian.
All right. Thank you very much, Chad. And thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your busy days. I know, this time of year especially, but during the week, it's tough to step away from work for a little bit. But I hope to, really engage you with a very important topic, because at the end of the day, we're all in the same business, which is retaining and attracting great people. And one of the ways that we do that is by making sure that we have a work environment that we can keep as safe as possible. So as we look at what we hope to accomplish today, I want to start off by just giving a general definition of workplace violence. From there, I'll talk about something that really affects our industry in particular, and some of the staggering stats when it comes to the threat that healthcare workers in particular deal with on a regular basis. From there, I'll get into some definitions of the four major types of workplace violence, and transition from there to some of the costs and the impact on your organizations when we don't deal with workplace violence. And finally, I'll finish out before the Q&A with getting into some violence prevention strategies. Although we have just an hour with us today, there are some things that you can start to think about doing. And I'll also share some additional resources that you can look into if you want to maybe evaluate your own workplace violence prevention strategies in place. So workplace violence, by definition, is really any act or threat, physical violence, harassment, intimidation, or other threatening, disruptive behaviors that occur at the work site. And these can range from threats and verbal assault to physical assaults, and in some cases, unfortunately, even homicides. And when we look at the current landscape, 14% of work-related injuries are the result of violent attacks. We often think about work-related injuries and workman comp injuries having to do with slips and falls, cuts, injuries, burns, bruises, things of that nature. But 14% of those that are fatal are often the result of violent attacks, and that's something that we should keep forefront in our mind, because again, we want to try to make sure that we're keeping our people safe. Whether it's our residents, our patients, our employees. We want to protect them as much as we can from workplace violence. But in the healthcare space, it's particularly concerning. The National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health said that healthcare workers, in particular nurses, are at a far higher risk of workplace violence compared to most other professions. The World Health Organization also did a study that showed up to 38% of healthcare workers, so close to 40% of healthcare workers, suffer physical violence at some point in their careers. In addition, the U.S. Department of Labor, through the BLS, showed that hospital workers, those that work in social work, and also those in nursing and residential care facilities, have the highest incident rates of violent, non-fatal assaults, based on a study that they did back in 2020. So healthcare workers in particular are at higher risk. It's some of the nature of the business that we deal with. And when we get into the specific types of workplace violence, we'll talk a little bit more about those. So the four types of workplace violence are criminal intent, customer or client-based violence, worker-on-worker violence, and then finally, workplace violence that's related to a personal relationship. And to dig a little deeper into each of those, criminal intent is often when the perpetrator of the violence has no legitimate business relationship to the workplace, and they're often entering these workplaces with the plan to commit some sort of criminal act or robbery. In our world, when we have retail as part of what we do, sometimes they're attempting to steal money. Obviously, in the healthcare setting, we also have an additional risk of people who have criminal intent to steal drugs. And so these are some things that we face on a regular basis as healthcare workers, where we have to be concerned of the criminal intent aspect and how that might show its place in the workplace. The second type, customer or client, are when the perpetrator is either the recipient or the object of a service provided by the affected workplace or the victim. The assailant may be a current or former client, patient, customer, passenger, criminal suspect, inmate, or prisoner. And we can all think of situations where we've probably encountered that in the healthcare space, where this is someone that we're giving service to or trying to take care of. It could be, a potential current or former client. That is somebody that is the perpetrator in this case. And also sometimes this is someone that is visiting these individuals as well that we're providing care to. And they can often be upset because of their perception of a lack of care or their perception of the speed of care in some situations where they're coming in and getting taken care of, and they're feeling that they aren't reflected or considered as urgent as some of the other people that we're taking care of. That frustration can sometimes escalate and turn into violent encounters. The third type, worker on worker, is when our employees and team members have an escalated situation where they start off by having a verbal disagreement, and that escalates over time and potentially can get to the point of physical violence. It may stay as threats and verbal abuse, but it can also, of course, escalate to physical violence. Some of those, of course, are situations where there is a disagreement about schedules, disagreement about whose responsibility it is to complete a particular task. And one of the big ways that worker on worker sometimes shows up is when we unfortunately have to do a separation or termination. And during that conversation of termination, the person becomes upset and potentially becomes verbally or physically abusive to the person who's carrying out the termination, or sometimes in cases, other people that they feel might be responsible for them being terminated. A great example there would be someone is receiving corrective action and possible termination because they violated a policy. And if their perception is that one of their coworkers is the one who informed the manager that they were violating the policy, they want to take some sort of retaliation against that individual. And so that's a way that this can show up in the workplace. And then finally, the fourth type is when it comes to personal relationships. And this is a situation where the perpetrator is someone who does not work for us, but they're known to have some sort of personal relationship with an employee. This can be a family member of a current or former employee. This can be somebody in a romantic relationship with a current or former employee. This can also be someone who, just knows a friend from a friendship, someone that is an employee there. And because they have that personal relationship, perhaps they're classmates or have some sort of other personal relationship outside the workplace, whatever is going on in their personal relationship can show up in the workplace. Another situation where personal relationships can sometimes impact workplace violence may not happen in the space, but it could be a situation of a romantic relationship between one of our employees and someone outside of the workplace that turns abusive. And so then we are dealing with the situation either because the perpetrator comes into our workplace or because the victim in this case is one of our employees, and we're starting to notice signs that they may possibly be the victim of personal violence outside of the workplace. But I want to, really step back for a second and just as a reminder here, although a lot of what we've talked about is when it's escalated to a physical level, workplace violence does not have to be physical. Sometimes it is simply a matter of verbal abuse or threats that also have a negative impact, because those types of violence will impact the morale and the overall mental health of the organization and the people. Because not all violence is physical. So I want to share with you a personal situation that happened with me involving workplace violence that was not of a physical nature, but ultimately did have a major impact on all the people involved, and then down the road, lots of others. A few years ago, I got a text message from one of my former colleagues, and the text message just simply asked me, Brian, did you see the newspaper? And I wasn't sure what they were responding to or referring to. But before I could get back with a response, I received another text message from another former colleague, followed by another text message by another former colleague. And all in all, there are about half a dozen former colleagues and one person that I currently work with who were asking me if I had seen this news article. And the news article in question was actually about a restaurant that was nearby where I lived in town. It was probably about a 10-minute walk. It was a very well regarded restaurant where the team members that work there were some former colleagues of mine, but in particular, the head chef of this particular place was a former colleague of mine and all the people who had been texting me that day. And the article was about a major complaint that was filed by a number of the team members there about the hostile work environment they had experienced, primarily driven by this executive chef, but it also mentioned some of the other culinary team and some of the head managers that work within this particular place as well. This was something that started, I guess you would call it smaller, but really escalated because it became more of a culture of that particular location where everybody got involved. And unfortunately, a lot of people were the victims of this negative behavior. And one of the managers that was named in it, the chef and one of the other managers, eventually, after this story broke with all the news quotes and all the former employees doing it, they brought in an outside company to do an investigation into the workplace culture there and what had happened. Ultimately, a lot of people ended up losing their jobs or resigning as a result of this. But it was really damning what had been going on in this workplace. For me, I think the big red flag, as I read through the article and I talked to some of these people that had been texting me, was that some of these behaviors with the chef in particular were not just isolated to this incident. They started to share stories about things that had happened years ago when we all worked with the chef that, unfortunately I had not been aware of at the time, but, everyone else had been aware of, and they had went to try to make complaints and nothing was really done about it. Amongst the complaints, there were a number from one of the hostesses who worked there. She was a young African American woman. And in her statements, she shared that there was one day in particular that she had come into work, and that day she had decided to go to see a hairstylist, and she had gotten her hair straightened. And when she came in that day to work, the manager said to her, wow, I really like your hair. You finally look pretty like all the other girls that work here. And that was one of the kindest things he had said to her based on her statements that she shared. There was a lot more of that kind of verbal abuse, language that was used of a racist nature, and then also, of course, some things of a sexual nature. There was a pastry chef who was mentioned in the article who mentioned one day while she was in the kitchen and she had bent down to pick something up that dropped off the floor, the comments that the chef had made about her of a sexual nature. And there were a number of employees that had all seen and witnessed this and had been a part of it. And like I mentioned, this went back to an earlier time when I had worked with this chef prior and some of the other managers that had worked there. Apparently, this chef had done this sort of thing before. A number of people had brought the complaints forth to human resources and to the senior leadership of the organization we had all worked with. And I'm not sure exactly what their investigation showed, but that person continued to work for the company and went on to continue his career and took a lot of these behaviors on with him. And the issue that we deal with when it comes to this is that we're talking about now something that went from, possibly an initial statement to something that became bullying in the workplace. The Workplace Bullying Institute did a study back in 2021 The results of their study showed that over 79 million US workers are affected by workplace bullying. And if you can look at the map here that I'm presenting, that's 79.3 million US workers that were affected by workplace bullying is the equivalent of those 12 states that are marked in the reddish colors. So that's just how prevalent this problem is in the workplace that we need to make sure that we can address. 30% of workers that were interviewed mentioned that they had been the victims of abusive conduct in the workplace. Another 19% reported that they have at least witnessed abusive behavior and conduct in the workplace. And 66% of respondents in that same study said that they were aware of workplace bullying happening in their workplace. So some pretty staggering numbers to think about just how prevalent even this thing that is not necessarily escalating to the violent side of things is in the workplace and how people are dealing with it. But when you look at what happens after this, the impact and the cost is pretty high. Because as you can imagine, whether it's verbal or it's physical violence in the workplace that people are dealing with, there's an aftermath for the people that are experiencing it. There's also an aftermath and impact for the people that witness it. And, you know, even in situations where some of the people move on, those that are left behind are often dealing with the scars of watching this sort of behavior or being the victims of this sort of behavior on a regular basis. 57% of Americans polled in a Fortune study in 2023 said that they've at least experienced some level of burnout in the workplace. And this is just one of the effects that people deal with when they're in environments that are particularly hostile and where bullies are allowed to run rampant. And when asked, you know, why a workplace behavior is something that becomes, you know, a workplace environment that is toxic and abusive, the number one response from people is that organizational factors are the reason why it really becomes toxic and abusive. And amongst the organizational factors are things like the management's history of responses to it. It's the fear, of course, of retaliation. And then also, what is the response of the human resources team that is working and dealing with this? With the management response, I think one of the ways that we, you know, need to make sure that we're doing right is in that response, whenever there are complaints that are received, and this also ties into the human resources response as well, is making sure that there is an update for the person who brought the complaint forth. Oftentimes, someone brings a complaint forth, even if it is investigated and proper actions are taken based on company policy, the complainant never hears back from whoever they gave the complaint to. So they're not sure whether or not it was dealt with. And then the perception becomes that this was possibly swept under the rug. You know, one of the other things that you have to deal with when it comes to organizational factors is the biggest fear that people deal with when they want to bring forth a complaint, whether they're the victim or someone who is a witness to it, is the fear of retaliation. And oftentimes the perpetrator is someone who's in a higher position of power in the org chart. So they're afraid that if they do bring this forth and it comes out that they were the person who brought the complaint forth, that there's going to be some retaliation where there's going to be a negative effect on them and their careers and their ability to feed their families moving forward. Number two reason that, you know, the workplace can potentially become toxic or abusive is the personality of the perpetrator. You know, we're talking typically of people who have a bullying personality. And again, this makes people afraid and uncomfortable. Another thing that we always have to think about is what is the willingness of our coworkers and sometimes these witnesses to help. It is difficult sometimes in human resources when we do receive a complaint and we start to investigate and we reach out and try to talk to witnesses, and the witnesses don't want to talk because they are afraid of potential retaliation, or they just simply say they don't want to get caught up in it. It's none of their business. So when people are not willing to help, it often allows these bad behaviors to go on because there isn't enough evidence to take any concrete action towards it. And then lastly, the target's actions. Sometimes the victim or the target of this sort of, behavior don't want to bring forth a complaint, where they feel defenseless, where they can't have anyone on their side as an ally to them to help. So these complaints get swept under the rug, unfortunately, and sometimes go unresolved. And when we look at the situations where bullying has been stopped in the workplace, one of the first interesting stats that I want to show here is, if you look at that first blue line, the negative outcomes for the target, 67% of that is the reasons why bullying stopped. But that 67% is made up of 23% situations the target, so the victim, voluntarily left the job to escape more mistreatment. So they've either experienced mistreatment in the workplace, and instead of being able to get to a point where there was resolution and they were to continue their own employment, 23% of them just decided to move on and go do something else. Another 17% were forced to quit because the work conditions were made deliberately intolerable. So if the perpetrator in this case was allowed to get away with it, and did retaliate, sometimes they make the workplace so miserable that the people felt they had no other choice but to quit in that case. 12% of cases, the employer terminated the target or the victim. And then the other 15% that makes up that 67% is the target transferred to a different job or a location with the same employer, where they said, I want to stay with the company. I just can't work with this particular perpetrator anymore. So they moved into a different position, or they moved into another location with that same employer. But that's still, those four reasons, that 67% is, a situation where the target, the victim, is the one who ultimately has the negative outcome. It's not the individual who's the perpetrator. In the situations where there were negative outcomes for the perpetrator, the highest percentage of those where the perpetrator was punished but were able to keep their job, a smaller percentage where the perpetrator was terminated, and then a very small percentage, 3% of situations, the perpetrator voluntarily quit and they decided to leave. But only in 10% of cases did they feel that, the positive actions by the employer or the positive actions by their coworkers were able to stop the bullying from happening. And another 12% situation said the behavior just did not stop, so it continued on throughout it. So now I want to move a little bit into how we might think about preventing this behavior. Again, we won't be able to solve everything in the hour that we have today, but there are some actions as we look at the four different types of workplace violence that may be able to help us prevent some of them in the future. So when it comes to criminal intent, some of the things that we can do are to make sure that there is training around how do we respond to robberies. Not many workplaces actually have any sort of training, whether it's an orientation or ongoing training for their team members and how they are supposed to respond if a situation arose where there is an attempted criminal activity. And so they find themselves in a situation where a robbery does happen and everyone's dealing with it the first time and isn't exactly sure about how they're supposed to handle it. Depending on the type of environment we work in, it may be valuable to also have active shooter training. And again, this is not an excuse for bad behavior. And I know there's a huge, larger discussion to have around, safety around firearms in general. But, what we want to do, of course, is just to make sure that if these unfortunate incidents do happen, that our employees are in a situation where they have had the training to put themselves in the best situation to survive. Some other precautions that we can take when it looks at criminal intent are looking at the operational precautions during at-risk hours. So if there are times of day that we might be more at risk than others, what are some things that we can do, whether it is additional security, additional staffing during those peak at-risk hours, what surveillance and lighting can we make sure that we're providing so that we can try to minimize or eliminate the spaces where somebody might be able to easily enter and exit our buildings, and even if they are, that we do have the proper video surveillance and lighting present to hopefully deter people away from taking potential criminal activity. And if they do, that we are in a position that we have the evidence that we need to be able to provide that to law enforcement, to make sure that we can hopefully get an arrest in those cases. When it comes to potential violence from customers or clients, one of the things we can do is assess our staffing levels. Sometimes that violent or angry behavior from a potential customer or client comes again because they feel that we are not giving them rapid enough or adequate enough service. So, during those peak times, can we look at what our staffing levels look like and make sure that we aren't overwhelming our people and unfortunately providing a service that might, escalate to someone being very upset to the point where they're verbally or physically abusive? Can we have, violence and de-escalation training to make sure that when we are encountering those people that are escalated and angry, that our team members know how to possibly begin to de-escalate the situation? Interpersonal communication skills, making sure we're reinforcing those with our team so that they can be better communicators and hopefully avoid any kind of conflict from the beginning. And then in those situations where we do get to the point where it does get physical, making sure that we have training around basic restraint and basic self-defense. Again, from the mindset that we want to equip our employees to protect themselves and possibly protect others, should they get to the point where an altercation does get to the point of being physically violent. With worker on worker, when two people that are employees of ours possibly get to the point of being verbally or physically abusive, one of the ways, of course, that we can try to prevent it before someone becomes an employee of ours is by making sure that we're conducting thorough criminal background checks and reference checks. Sometimes, with a criminal background check, this might not be a person who's popped up on the radar of law enforcement, but they may have exhibited some behaviors in former jobs, which might be a red flag for us. By doing those reference checks with former employees, former employers and managers, we might find out a little bit more about why they're no longer employed with them, and possibly avoid making a bad hire to start off with. We can also make sure that safety in the workplace is something that is a part of our orientation and onboarding plan, and that we do have annual training around things like conflict resolution, to make sure that our team members are equipped to handle when those situations come up. Another reason that I mentioned earlier around worker on worker violence that happens is during terminations. So we can absolutely do our best to make terminations as safe as possible, making sure that someone isn't doing a termination by themselves one-on-one, and hopefully has a witness there when possible, because that second person often makes the individual not feel like they can get away with whatever they might want to get away with if it's one-on-one. But then also getting in the practice of being prepared to escalate any concerns to security if the person begins to exhibit any behaviors that might make us worry that this is going to turn into a physical situation. And then also escorting the individual out of the building, making sure that we can also recover or deactivate any badges so that they don't have access to get in the building any longer, and notifying the appropriate people in our locations that this individual no longer works there and should not be on the premises in the future. And then when we get back to those situations I referred to earlier around bullying and hostile work environments, a great way that we can try to prevent that is by introducing 360 reviews, where the review is not only coming from the person that an individual reports to, we're getting feedback as part of the review process from the people that report to the individual and some of their colleagues. I have used 360 reviews in a number of different organizations and found them incredibly valuable, because you will find out truly what a leader is thought of by their team, And this is an opportunity when you do it correctly and do it anonymously, where people will share things that they might not share in other environments because they're afraid of retaliation. And because it's anonymous, I mean, your HR department or whoever knows who they're sending the reviews to, but the individual doesn't know who's given the feedback. So it allows people to feel more confident about being honest about what they might be experiencing in the workplace. And then in those situations where the violence, the perpetrator is possibly part of a personal relationship, we want to see if we can identify any potential victims or perpetrators of intimate partner violence. So things that are going on outside of the workplace that sometimes do spill into the workplace. One of the ways that we can do that is by ensuring that we have a supportive culture, making sure that we truly do have confidentiality and our team members know who they can reach out to confidentially report any issues that they're running into outside of the workplace where they might need some help, making sure there is protection from retaliation truly in the workplace, and when any retaliation is reported, that it is escalated quickly and responded to rapidly. And then also making sure that you have an employee assistance program, because the reality is some of our team members are always going to feel more confident talking to someone outside of work and sharing something personal that they might be experiencing versus talking to someone inside of work. And it's a great idea if you have bulletin boards, et cetera, in your workplace and you have an employee assistance program, put that information front and center so that it is always available, and not only pull out your employee assistance program flyers and information when you become when you have knowledge that someone might be dealing with something where they need assistance. By having it readily available, that's something that someone is probably seeing on a regular basis, and it's more front of mind and they're more willing to reach out on their own versus when they have a concern or you have a concern that someone might be the victim of intimate partner violence and you're going to them and saying, hey, I want to tell you about this program that we offer. And then just some additional resources, and we're going to send you over a PDF of this presentation. These hyperlinks will take you directly to this information. The first is a guide that OSHA put together on worker safety in hospitals. The second is a workplace violence prevention for nurses study that was done by the Center for Disease Control. And then finally, the World Health Organization also put together information on preventing violence against healthcare workers. And these are all guides. They range in size. Some are just 2 to 3 pages. The World Health Organization is, quite a large document, but has some really concrete ideas that you can put into place to make sure that you're able to hopefully prevent violence in the workplace. All right, Chad, have we, I want to turn it right now into some Q&A. So Chad, have we had any questions come in so far?
Yeah, actually, Brian, we have 3 questions here. And if anybody else would like to submit a question, that can go through the chat or the Q&A section, and I certainly will get that answered by Brian. First one we have is there a reason the data around workplace violence doesn't seem to be updated annually?
That's a great question. I mean, one of the reasons that the data does not get updated annually is because all the different bodies that are doing research into it have different ways that they measure. So whether it's CDC, whether it's OSHA, whether it's NIOSH, like they all have different metrics. So there's not a consistency across the board with it. And additionally, because this is workplace violence and we're dealing with it from a physical and a non-physical standpoint, the reporting is not always there. Some people suffer in silence and don't, ever make an actual official complaint. So, when we talked about that World Health Organization statistic that said 38% of healthcare workers say they've experienced physical violence, sure, the number is much higher than that. But some people just never say anything to anyone, or the place that they work at doesn't have any great reporting metrics or way to report.
Excellent, thank you. Next question we have, how have you been successful dealing with bullying in the workplace with the constant fear of retaliation?
It's tough. I think one group that obviously fears retaliation is the targets or the victims of this workplace bullying. And then the other group is the potential witnesses. One thing that we make very clear, and this is one of the first things I say to anyone that I speak with as part of an investigation, is, we have an obligation as an organization to protect from retaliation. And if you should find yourself in a situation where you feel you're being retaliated against because you spoke to me, you need to call me immediately. And just by getting that out front before I even start to ask questions when I'm investigating, possible bullying in the workplace, it sets the precedent in the mind of the person I'm talking to that this is important and I should report this as this happens. Another thing that I find very valuable is sometimes when I hear about possible bullying in the workplace, it's not from the victim, it's from someone else. And so what I try to do is corroborate as much as I can before I go to the actual victim. So if I can get 2 or 3, people to actually speak to me about what they've witnessed and also ask it in a way that it is very general, and I'm not mentioning any names. I'm not saying, hey, did Brad say this mean thing to you? It's more of, did you witness anything that you might consider unprofessional during your time working there? Have you ever witnessed anything that you would consider harassment or bullying? It's just a general question. And because I'm not asking specifics, people start to minimize their fear of retaliation because they're saying, okay, there's just a general question. He's not asking me about this person and I'm afraid is going to come back. I think the other way that I've been successful is when there were situations of retaliation or even in some cases threat of retaliation, because we took quick action against the perpetrator, including termination, people started to get the message that it is okay to come forth and talk because they take it seriously. But when you don't take it seriously and when you don't take that action, people are always going to live in a little bit of fear.
Okay, thank you. This next question actually is pretty spot on with a discussion that we were previously having with our chief nursing committee. She was dealing with a situation similar to this. So I'm curious to hear your response to this. So do you have any suggestions to help encourage employees who may be victims of violence at home to seek help?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I mentioned is, having that EAP information, or if you have some sort of hotline or anything internally, having that front and center. Like, don't wait until it happens to then go to someone and have an uncomfortable conversation where you're like, generally like, hey, by the way, we have an EAP program. They're available 24/7 in case something is going on that you need help. That's always going to make the person feel awkward because they think you're accusing them of something going on and trying to hide something. But if you have it front and center, if it's something that you talk about from day one with orientation and onboarding, people know the resources there, have annual reminders that the resources there. Just in general, like if you're talking about mental health, for instance, like during Mental Health Awareness Month, like bring it up again. Every time that you can bring it up and every time that you can get it front and center makes it a little bit easier for people to come forth. And also how you respond in the past. Like one of the data points I shared earlier is, about a hostile work environment and how it gets that way is because of like previous manager and HR responses. If what you've done in the past is truly reflective of you being a supportive workplace, the word will get out. Your employees will actually do the marketing, for lack of a better term, for you. They will share with others that they went through a particularly difficult time in their lives and HR or their leader or whoever was there for them. And that word of mouth will get more people to buy into that it is that sort of supportive workplace.
Excellent. And actually, I have another question to add on to that. And this more so maybe just looking for recommendations, because again, meeting with our chief nursing committee this morning, do you have any recommendations or, maybe suggestions as far as, so say there is a patient situation in an emergency room where a patient is violent, unruly, how to de-escalate that situation? Or is there a way that, is there any suggestions you can make or recommendations as far as the best way to handle that?
Yeah, I mean, It's tough in the environment, and I will say, when we're talking about our medical professionals, we're talking about people who are responsible for doing so much in their day, and it's hard to ask them to take on something else. Like, you have to provide this physical care, you have to have knowledge about medications, you have to have knowledge about policies, you have to have all this charting work and everything else that you do. Oh, and now when someone comes in and they start getting angry and violent at you, I expect you to be a martial arts master and a black belt. That's certainly not what we're hoping to do. But we are hoping to at least provide everybody with a very base level of
Mhm.
safety. And so whether that is just basic, you know, pinning techniques, basic de-escalation to try to get it from a point before it gets violence. But if it does get violent, what is the best way to ultimately avoid? I actually am a martial artist. I've studied martial arts for most of my life. And some of the first things that we learned was getting off the line or getting out of the way. When someone is coming charging at you, just getting off the line, getting out of that line of action is your first and best thing that you can do. Like, at a higher skill level, yes, you might be able to grab a limb or pin them in a certain way or whatever. But if you can just get out of the way as the first thing, that is going to affect a lot. I remember I was unfortunately about 10 years ago, I went out with some friends not too far from here, and this fight broke out. There was a couple of people that I worked with and a couple of people that were randomly there at the bar. And I'm not sure what started it, but it got pretty violent pretty quick. The bouncers came in, started throwing people out left and right. And one of the people that was left behind, his brother, was one of the victims. And so he decided that somebody there must have been the one that hit his brother. So he wanted to go after everyone. And he decided to pick on me. And he starts pointing at me, going, "Did you hit my brother? Did you hit my brother?" And he's using foul language and coming at me. And just have my hands up, like, "I didn't hit your brother. I don't even know who your brother is. I'm just out for a drink, trying to enjoy myself." And finally, he just decided to charge at me. And I like waited and waited and waited. And as he got really close, I just stepped out of the way and he went flying past me. And he like looked at his hands kind of amazed because he didn't make physical contact. And he charged at me again, and I waited and I moved out the way again. And after the second time it happened and he couldn't figure out what was going on, he decided to just start picking on someone else. So I never raised my hand to strike him. I didn't try to trip him. I didn't try to do any complex kung fu move. I just got out of the way. And if you can do that, it buys a little bit more time, whether
Mhm.
that's a security response, other people to be able to jump in and come to your support. But getting out of the way after you've tried to de-escalate is your best bet.
Excellent. I know a lot of our facilities and our members are now utilizing extra security metal detectors in their emergency rooms. Do you find this is effective, or do you look at it as, um, I don't want to say find it as effective, but is that just adding to the possibility to incite, or is it effective uh, use of the staff?
I don't think that adding metal detectors is going to necessarily increase the chance of violence.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what it could do potentially, and this is something you always have to be aware of, it could potentially increase the anxiety of your team because they're seeing these other measures coming in, and now it's kind of front and center in their mind. Do I need to be worried about somebody bringing a gun to work when maybe last week they weren't as worried?
Mm-hmm.
But now that they see a metal detector and everybody has to get scanned to come in, does it possibly add some anxiety to them? I think anything that you can do to try to kind of low hanging fruit is a positive. So if you have metal detectors in place that are going to, pick up a potential gun or a potential knife or some other metal weapon that someone can use
Mm-hmm.
in place, it's a positive. Will it stop everything? Absolutely not. If someone brings a stick or a baseball bat or a piece of plastic that's really hard to hit someone with, that's not going to get picked up on the metal detector necessarily. So then you're getting to the point, well, is a metal detector enough? Do I need a full body scanner and an x-ray and all these sorts of things? And, I think it ultimately comes down to taking a look at your environment, assessing what the risk is, assessing what the financial impact of a violent attack is going to be. You know, is that person going to quit? Are you going to have to spend more money to replace that person? Are you going to have to spend more money to have a counselor come in, grief counselor to your team, if someone really gets hurt badly or possibly loses their life? And you have to weigh like what's most important. The most important thing is that people can come to work and they can feel safe.
Mhm.
And they're not thinking about possibly losing their lives when they've entered a noble profession where they ultimately want to heal people. And so whatever you have to do that, I say it's worth it. But there's certainly going to be maybe some hospitals or healthcare centers or senior living communities that are less at risk than others. It's just the nature of geography and things of that nature that we have to be concerned about.
Excellent. One of our attendees actually commented on that question as well regarding the metal detectors, and they basically said that the placement of additional metal detectors at entrances at our hospital locations increase the staff's feeling of safety rather than create that additional anxiety source. So it's certainly some are feeling the relief from it, so to speak.
I mean, when my high school put them in, I felt great.
Yeah.
Because there was unfortunately an increase in violence. I never worry about it. I honestly worry about the opposite. When I visit hospitals and senior living communities around the country and I can just walk in, I get concerned. You know, I've been to places where they don't even check your ID and give you like a visitor badge when you walk in. You just walk straight past the security desk and they're like, "What are you looking for?" And I say, I'm looking for the dining facilities. And they say, "Okay, it's over the next building to the left." I'm like, "Great. Just walk right in here. Could do anything. No one has any idea." So I feel safer as someone as a visitor if there are security measures.
Excellent. Thank you, Ryan. Does anybody else have any questions out there? I'll give it a minute. Okay. Well, Brian, I'd like to thank you for today. This has been fantastic. Certainly very informational. Unfortunately, it's a trending topic that's not going away. So it's something that we're going to have, as far as in the healthcare realm, we're going to have to live with this and just figure out solutions and obviously the best techniques in order to de-escalate and how to identify, needless to say. So certainly appreciate the content today. For everyone attending, I will be sharing the PowerPoint deck that Brian had shared today. We did record today's session as well. So if you're interested in having a recorded version as well, feel free to reach out to me. But again, thank you all for attending today. And we look forward to seeing you at our next educational session. And have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. And thanks for your dedication to your teams and keeping them safe.
Thank you, Brian.